Romans, and with Romans we start a new kind of literature. We start literature called the epistles, and these are letters written by a man, many of them written by Paul. In fact, Romans we know is written by Paul, but from Romans all the way through Hebrews are, actually all the way through Jude are letters written to churches or to individuals by a person. Romans is written by the Apostle Paul to the church at Rome in about 57 AD. It's one of the earliest letters that had been written. Paul wrote this book to Romans, or the letter to Romans, because he had not visited them. He had never been to Rome. He had the desire to go there, was hoping to see them in person, but because he had not been there, he was very serious about presenting them and taking to them the gospel in written form. I believe that because Paul had not been there, what Romans is what Paul did when he first came into a city. He would go to the synagogue. I believe he worked through the book of Romans as he went into that book. He writes to establish this church in the gospel of which he is not ashamed. And really that's what the book of Romans is. The book of Romans is the gospel, especially in chapters 1 through 8. It is the gospel on display as Paul writes to the Romans and encourages them with the gospel, encourages them with truth, encourages them with the theme of justification by faith, and calls them to walk in that faith by which they've been justified. Romans is incredibly deep in its theology. It's probably one of the most theological books there is, because again, what Paul does is he walks through man's sinful condition. He walks through God's righteous provision of a Savior. He walks through what that provides in hope for the believer. He walks through what that does and how we live in the church, how we live in society, how we live in our families. And he calls the believer then to take that gospel and take it to the world, and walks through his own struggle, his own situation, his own life in the gospel. Again, it's a gospel of which he is not ashamed, and which he calls his reader to not be ashamed of either. And he's calling his church, this church at Rome, to stand strong in the midst of what could become and would become very much persecution. The outline for the book of Romans is really easy to see as you read through. The first thing Paul does in the first chapter is to reveal God's righteousness in the gospel. He says God's righteousness revealed in the gospel. That's in chapter 1, verse 1 through 17. And he provides then what the gospel does. He provides that the hope the gospel produces, and he calls his reader to hope. The second major section is God's righteous wrath against sinners. And what Paul does in chapter 1:18 through 3:20 is he actually shows how God is righteous in being wrathful against sin. He shows the sinfulness of Gentiles, he shows the sinfulness of Jews, and finally he shows the sinfulness of all men, as he talks about how all men have sinned and all have fallen short of the glory of God. But he doesn't leave us there. He doesn't leave us there. He doesn't leave us just in sin, because the next section in chapter 3, verse 21 through 4:25, he talks about God's righteous salvation of his chosen people. He writes about how there is a justification that is apart from the law. There's justification that doesn't depend on our work, but the justification that depends on the work that Christ accomplished on the cross. And this justification is by faith, even as Abraham was justified by his faith. It's an interesting argument he makes that it's always been justification by faith, that no one has ever been justified by their works, and that's because God did the work for us through his Son Jesus Christ. Then he calls the reader to hope in the light of God's righteousness. Because God's righteousness, we have that, we then have hope. And chapter 5, verse 1, all the way through 8:39 are a great presentation of the hope of God. As Paul talks about this relationship we have, we were enemies of God, now we're family of God. We were instruments of Satan, now we're instruments of righteousness. We may suffer, but the sufferings that we're going to face on earth are nothing to be compared with the sufferings, with the joy or the glory that will be revealed in the eternal state. And then he goes through that great passage at the end of chapter 8, where he talks about nothing can separate us from the love of God. And as you read, I hope you crescendo as you read. And in fact, I would encourage you to read that section out loud. And don't be afraid to rejoice in what you're reading, because this affects you as a believer. What a thrill it is to know that nothing can separate us from the love of God. There is no condemnation for those who believe. Even though we know who we are, we know that we're sinners, as Paul recognized in chapter 7. He concludes there's no condemnation for those who believe. In chapters 9 through 11, he kind of takes a question, because the Jews would then ask, well, if there's salvation apart from the law, then what about the Jews? What's God doing with them? Has he just cast them off? Has he forgotten them? And what Paul does in chapters 9 through 11 is he says that God has not rejected, but God has a righteous plan for Israel, and God will restore Israel. God's promises to Israel will be realized and will be completely realized. Israel will be saved, as Paul says at the end of chapter 11, and all Israel will be saved. I believe that's yet to come. I believe that hasn't happened yet. I believe there will be a real kingdom established. I believe that Paul is referring to that, and Paul is referring to the promises of God kept to his people Israel. God hasn't thrown them off. God hasn't abandoned them. God is still at work in them. As you get to chapter 12, through basically almost the rest of the book, through almost the end of 15, Paul talks about God's righteousness in everyday living. He talks about how we live in the church by using the gifts God's given us. He talks about how we live in the church by forgiving one another, by loving one another, by not providing evil for evil. He talks about how we live in the world. He talks about how we respond to governing officials. And that's really important for us today, because we might not like who our president is. We might not like who's in charge of us, supposedly. But he calls us. He calls us to submit to those authorities. And his authority was a guy named Nero, and he would submit to him. In fact, Paul would submit to him to the point of death. That's how significant Paul took the charge to live righteously, to live rightly in the world, and to let God's righteousness come out in your everyday living. Paul finally proclaims God's righteousness and his own desire, his own call to be a gospel to the Gentiles, and to take the gospel where it had not yet been taken. That was Paul's heart. Paul's desire was to take the gospel, proclaim God's righteousness where it had not yet been proclaimed. And that's in chapter 15, 14 through most of 16. And then finally, Paul gives a final summary of the righteousness of God and final concluding remarks as he ends the book. The book of Romans is just full of doctrine, full of practical exhortation, and I hope it really opens your eyes to the gospel and its effect in your life as you live every day.